The day the English burned your village for sport. It's late in the night, and the only light in your village is the warm orange flicker from behind shuttered windows, a small comfort against the blackness of the medieval countryside. For generations your family has tilled these fields, drawing water from the same well, living and dying within the same stone walls as your ancestors. But tonight, sleep is uneasy. Somewhere beyond the river, dogs bark, and someone's ox lowing carries too long in the air. You hear the distant beat of hooves, the rhythmic crunch of boots through the frost, and then the sudden screaming. This is not war for land, nor even war for pride. What's coming is something colder. The English are not here to conquer, but to destroy, to leave a memory so raw, so unforgettable, that it will echo in every whispered lullaby for centuries. You've heard stories, the kind that pass from mother to daughter, about villages that simply vanished, wiped from the earth with no survivors to bury the dead. You've heard tales of armored knights who laugh as they burn what peasants spent decades building. Tonight, you become one of those stories. Your father throws open the door. The sky is no longer black, but a lurid, hellish red. The thatch on old Jacques' roof is caught, and the fire spreads like a curse, leaping from home to barn to granary. The English have come with torches soaked in pitch, their faces hidden behind iron visors, voices muffled by laughter and shouts in a language you barely understand. They don't even need to break down doors. The fire does their work for them. You try to run, past neighbors you've known all your life, past children shrieking for mothers already lost in the confusion. The air is thick with smoke and the sickening, sweet scent of burning grain. You stumble over a cart overturned in the chaos. Somewhere in the dark you hear steel striking flesh, but the violence is almost incidental. The real weapon is the fire itself. It devours everything, memories, dreams, the evidence you ever existed. This is what the English call a Chevauchée, a campaign of terror designed to break the spirit of a people, not just their armies. From the 100 Years' War to countless border raids, this was a tactic as old as feudal conflict. Soldiers ride hard and fast, striking deep behind enemy lines, not to seize castles, but to torch the lifeblood of the countryside. They burn wheat fields, poison wells, slaughter livestock, and leave no harvest for the winter. For the English crown, it's just another strategy, a way to force the enemy to the negotiating table by turning the land to ash. For you and your kin, it's a death sentence. Imagine the psychology behind it, the cold calculation that says if enough villages vanish, if enough children grow up haunted by nightmares of burning homes, the enemy will break. For the soldiers, it is a kind of sport. There is no resistance. The peasants are unarmed, helpless, their only crime being born on the wrong side of a royal claim. Some of the raiders are barely more than boys, eager for loot, driven by boredom and the promise of quick gold. Others are hardened veterans who know that terror is more effective than any sword. Even the landscape is complicit. The dry summer grass explodes into flame. Hedgerows become walls of fire. The wooden beams of your church, once a refuge, crack and collapse in a shower of sparks. Your ancestors' bones, buried in the churchyard, are now scorched beneath your fleeing feet. You run until your lungs burn, not sure if you are crying or choking. In the morning, the English are gone, leaving behind nothing but charred ruins and silence so deep it feels eternal. The survivors creep back, clutching what little they manage to save, maybe a scorched loaf of bread, a bent cooking pot, a handful of grain snatched from the edge of the flames. The old men dig shallow graves for the lost, while the women wail and curse the distant, invisible king who caused this. The lesson is clear. This is not just the destruction of property, but the erasure of hope itself. Entire generations are marked by these raids. Babies born after the fire grow up in makeshift shelters, learning to fear the sound of horses at night. The memory passes down, burned into the language and the lullabies, into the stories that grandparents whisper over dying embers. The English, for a generation, are no longer just an enemy. They are monsters, legends, nightmares. This is not an isolated act. During the 100 Years' War, these raids were systematic, deliberate, and devastating. Some French villages never recovered, others rebuilt, only to be burned again. This was psychological warfare, centuries before the term was invented. It was not just about killing bodies, but about killing the will to resist. And it worked. The French countryside became a patchwork of ruins and refugees, a landscape haunted by fear and loss. Peasant uprisings became desperate and violent. Loyalties shifted, trust dissolved. The trauma carved scars not only in the land, but in the culture itself. And yet, even here, there is a strange defiance. Some villagers return, rebuild, and risk everything again. There is a stubbornness to survival, a refusal to let the fire be the final word. But the scars remain, visible in the blackened timbers, the stories told by those who remember, and the unmarked graves in fields that should have been filled with wheat. This is the forgotten reality behind chivalric tales of knights and kings, the suffering of ordinary people, burned for sport, erased for strategy, remembered only in the silent ruins of a village that once was. This is the day the English burned your village, and it is a story that, once heard, is impossible to forget. When peasants had to pay the ransom for their captured lords, in the world of medieval Europe, the fates of the powerful and the powerless were tied together by chains far stronger than any iron. When a noble lord rode into battle, it was never just his own life that hung in the balance. Peasants, the backbone of every estate, waited in dread, because the outcome of those battles, fought between men in shining armor, could decide whether entire villages would eat or starve for the next year. What most people forget is that the ransoms of medieval warfare weren't just paid in gold or by the hands of kings. They were squeezed, coin by coin, chicken by chicken, from the desperate, calloused hands of peasants who owed everything to their lord and whose reward for loyalty was suffering on a scale almost unimaginable today. Imagine a summer's day after a disastrous defeat. The banners are torn, the fields are eerily silent, and the lord is missing, captured by the enemy, held for ransom. His family is frantic, his manor emptied of gold. And so the steward comes down to the village square with grim news. The ransom must be paid, and fast. The sum is monstrous, often the equivalent of years' worth of the estate's total production. The family silver, the harvest in storage, even the church's sacred relics are counted up and still fall short. The only hope is the people themselves. Every peasant, from the oldest widow to the youngest child, must give whatever they have. A pig, a chicken, a bushel of wheat, the seeds meant for next spring, or the coin set aside for winter firewood. There's no argument. Refusing isn't just unthinkable, it's dangerous. Medieval society was built on a rigid system. The Lord protected the people, and the people owed him service, even if that meant their own ruin. In return for their labor, they received his protection. But in moments like this, it was a protection that demanded payment in blood, sweat, and the slow death of hunger. Most peasants had never seen a gold coin in their lives. Their wealth was counted in eggs, turnips, and hours of daylight. Yet suddenly they were expected to save their master, a man who lived in stone walls and drank wine by the fire, from captivity in a rival's castle. The absurdity was crushing. But there was no escape. Refusal could mean exile, brutal punishment, or the loss of what little land they worked. And if the ransom was not paid, the consequences could be even worse. A lord who died in captivity meant a power vacuum. Rival nobles might seize the land, new taxes could be imposed, or, in the worst cases, peasant families could be expelled, their homes burned, their lives uprooted by the chaos of noble feuds. So the collection began. The steward, often himself a man hardened by years of scraping every last resource from the estate, would visit each hovel, taking careful notes, leaving nothing overlooked. Stories are recorded of entire villages stripped bare, livestock pens emptied, granaries left echoing and hollow. Sometimes the church would open its doors, but more often it was the poor themselves who bore the cost. Starvation followed. With next year's seed gone, the land could not be sown. With the animals sacrificed, there was no milk for the children. Winter, already a season of hardship, became a slow torture, every mouthful of food haunted by the memory of the ransom. Yet the cruelty did not end there. In some cases, the lords themselves, once freed, imposed extra taxes for years to come to reimburse themselves for the trauma of their captivity, even though it was the peasants who had saved them from a dungeon's misery. Resentment brewed in the mud and straw of the villages. Medieval chronicles tell of rare but brutal uprisings, moments when the weight became too much, when desperation exploded into rebellion. But most of the time, there was only silent endurance. Peasants learned to hide what little they could, to lie about the size of their harvest, to stretch bread and hope through long, cold months. The system was sustained by fear. The church, the nobility, and the crown all colluded in the story that this was the natural order, God's will. To question it was not just treason, but heresy. Medieval sermons often praised the peasants for their loyalty and patience, even as they starved. One of the most infamous examples came after the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, when the French king himself was captured. The ransom demanded by the English was astronomical, equivalent to the value of thousands of peasant families' lifetimes. To pay it, taxes and forced gifts rained down upon the countryside. Some villages simply ceased to exist, their people scattered or dead. Even in less famous incidents, the pattern was repeated over and over across centuries. Local lords, captured in petty feuds or border skirmishes, would ransom themselves at the expense of everyone beneath them. In a single day, a community's future could be erased by a noble's misfortune. This system of collective punishment exposed the reality of medieval society. No matter how hard you worked, how carefully you planned, your fate could be shattered in an instant by the ambitions or failures of those above you. The suffering was invisible to the chroniclers who wrote about the glory of knighthood and the pageantry of noble courts. But in the bones of the people, in the haunted eyes of mothers who had to watch their children waste away after the livestock was taken, the memory of these ransoms lingered for generations. Sometimes the only small mercy came from neighboring lords or the church, who might offer a little relief if a village's misery threatened to spill over into revolt or death. But mostly the cycle continued. The lords would ride off to war, the battles would end in ransom and ruin, and the peasants, who had never chosen the fight, would pay the final price. It's a reality that turns the old tales of chivalry inside out. Behind every knight's rescue, every dramatic escape from a rival's dungeon, there is a story of peasants who paid with everything they had. It is a reminder that history is not just the tale of kings and warriors, but of ordinary people, forced to carry burdens they could never choose, trapped in a system where their suffering was the currency of survival for their so-called protectors. And so, whenever you hear tales of heroic lords or noble families saved from captivity, remember the silent sacrifices made by the people in the shadows of castles, those who starved so their rulers could live, who lost everything so that a name, a lineage, a title might continue another generation. Their pain is the true cost written into the margins of history, a debt never repaid but always collected. The Black Prince's Chevauchée that left thousands starving. Imagine a land at harvest, gold fields stretching to the horizon, the air thick with the scent of ripe wheat and hope for winter survival. Now, picture that promise scorched black, the sky oily with smoke, and every barn reduced to ashes, leaving nothing but starvation behind. This was not a nightmare. This was southern France in the autumn of 1355, the year Edward, the Black Prince, unleashed a Chevauchée, an English war ride that changed the lives of thousands forever. Edward, eldest son of England's King Edward III, was only 25, but already his name carried a shadow. In the 100 Years' War, he was a legend, celebrated for courage, feared for ruthlessness. But his campaign in Gascony was not about glorious battles. It was about breaking the very spine of France by destroying its ability to feed itself. This was war not against armies, but against the land, the villages, the people who made the kingdom function. The Chevauchée began as the leaves turned. With nearly 7,000 hardened soldiers, knights, archers, mercenaries, Edward set out from Bordeaux. They moved fast, a storm of metal and hooves, their banners black against a reddening sky. Town after town was swept up in panic. The French king, Jean II, tried to rally a defense, but he was too slow. The English army's purpose wasn't conquest. They didn't stop to besiege castles or claim land. Their goal was terror, pure, calculated devastation. Peasant families watched in horror as the horizon glowed with unnatural fire. Crops meant for winter storage became kindling. Orchards were axed down. Mills, the lifeblood of any village, were targeted first, because without flour there is no bread. Livestock, the most valuable possession for a peasant, were slaughtered en masse or driven off by English troops. It wasn't enough to loot. Everything had to be destroyed, so nothing remained for those left behind. Picture a mother with her children hiding in a ditch, hearing the screams of neighbors and the drunken laughter of foreign soldiers. The crackle of burning thatch is everywhere. You clutch your youngest, praying the soldiers pass, knowing that even if they do, tomorrow you will have nothing left to feed your family. The well is poisoned, the fields sown with salt, the food stores carried off in wagons. All that's left is hunger. In villages like Montpezat, townsfolk begged for mercy. Some tried to buy the army off, handing over coins, wine, even their daughters, just to spare their homes. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. The prince's men had orders, burn everything. At Moissac, a prosperous market town, the English torched warehouses and granaries. One witness described the sky as red as blood for 3 days. So intense was the destruction that the smoke blotted out the sun. But this was no madness, it was policy. Scorched earth, calculated to force the French king to the bargaining table by starving his people and bankrupting his treasury. The economic damage was catastrophic. Fields blackened, livestock dead, the entire region faced famine. Grain prices soared, and desperate peasants sold children into service, or worse, just to survive another winter. Some villages were so completely destroyed they vanished from records for centuries. The trauma didn't end when the army marched away. Survivors stumbled back to the ruins, searching for anything edible. With crops gone, many ate roots, bark, or boiled leather. Disease followed close behind, as weakened bodies fell prey to plague and dysentery. The social order cracked. In some places, bands of orphans and widows roamed, begging, sometimes stealing, just to stay alive. Medieval chroniclers wrote of hollow-eyed ghosts wandering the roads, their homes and hopes both destroyed by the fire. Yet the horror of the Chevauchée went beyond hunger. It tore at the very fabric of peasant life. In the Middle Ages, most people never left their village. Your land, your neighbors, your animals, these were your world. When the English burned it all, they burned your sense of safety, your roots, your future. The trauma etched itself into memory. For years, parents frightened children into obedience by whispering, "The English will come." Edward the Black Prince returned to Bordeaux triumphant, hailed in England as a military genius. In France, his name became a curse. The Chevauchée was a success, if success means leaving 100,000 people on the edge of starvation and destroying a generation's hope. The scars of that campaign haunted southern France for decades. Even today, the memory of 1355 lingers in the landscape, in stories passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. This was medieval war at its most brutal. Not knights in shining armor, but scorched villages, empty bellies, and the slow death that follows in famine's wake. The Black Prince's Chevauchée wasn't just a raid. It was the weaponization of hunger itself, a reminder that in history's great struggles, it's often the powerless who pay the price. The fields can be replanted, the villages can be rebuilt. But the shadow cast by fire and starvation endures for generations. The next time you see a painting of chivalry, knights in shining mail, banners fluttering in the wind, remember that just beyond the frame there is always smoke. And in that smoke, the cries of those who had nothing left to lose because war had already taken everything. The Jacquerie uprising that ended in Butchery. In the spring of 1358, the French countryside trembled with a fury it had never known before. The land was already scarred. Decades of war had trampled the villages, the Black Death had thinned the fields, and endless taxes ground what remained of the peasantry into dust. Yet, beneath the ashes of ruin, something unexpected ignited. It began not with a grand declaration, but with a whisper passed from farmhouse to farmhouse, a simple truth no longer denied. Life under the nobility had become unendurable. When a handful of desperate peasants gathered in the village of Saint-Lô-des-Serons, none imagined their anger would explode into a national firestorm. But as word of rebellion spread, so did the courage to act. They armed themselves not with swords, but with farm tools, flails, scythes, whatever could be turned against their oppressors. The movement took a name that mocked their social status. They called themselves the Jacques, after the common peasant's tunic. The Jacques, as if to say, we are everyone, we are no one. The roots of this fury reached deep. For years, France's nobles had failed their country. The king, John II, was a prisoner in England. Ransom payments drained the nation's lifeblood. English raiding bands, the dreaded routiers, burned towns and seized crops, while the nobility, charged with protecting the land, hid in their strongholds or preyed upon the very peasants they swore to defend. When English invaders weren't stealing livestock, French lords were demanding ever more tribute to pay for their own ransoms or build ever taller stone walls. Hunger, humiliation, and helplessness grew unbearable. Until one outrage finally snapped the cord. It was the murder of a local noble, and for the peasants it felt less like a crime and more like a long-delayed justice. The revolt spread with terrifying speed. Villages erupted, sometimes dozens in a single day. Barns and manor houses, once symbols of power, were torched to blackened skeletons. The Jacques cut down minor nobles and their families, exacting a brutal retribution for years of exploitation and violence. Chroniclers, themselves from noble classes, would later paint the rebels as monsters, as animals drunk on blood. But for many peasants, these acts were desperate answers to centuries of pain. There was no grand strategy, no central leader, only the shared certainty that their lives had value and that their suffering would no longer be endured in silence. But the nobility, threatened at their very roots, responded with a savagery that far outstripped the rage of the Jacques. Led by the ruthless Charles the Bad, King of Navarre, the nobles organized swift, merciless retaliation. They gathered armies of knights and mercenaries descending on rebel-held villages with iron discipline and cold calculation. The first encounters were slaughters. Untrained, under-equipped, and leaderless, the Jacques stood little chance. Yet the vengeance of the lords went beyond military defeat. It became a campaign of terror, a message written in fire and blood. Villages that had harbored rebels were burned to the ground, their inhabitants hunted through forests and fields. Public executions became spectacles of horror, designed not just to punish but to eradicate the very idea of resistance. Men were drawn and quartered in the marketplace. Women and children, entire families, were hanged from the same trees where they had once gathered apples and pears. In some places, noble commanders ordered the hands of peasants cut off before they were killed, as a warning to all who might pick up arms again. The brutality was systematic and unrelenting. The bodies of the slain were left unburied, food for dogs and crows. Smoke from burning thatch darkened the sky for weeks. Chroniclers noted the stench of death drifted across the fields, and neighbors turned on each other in terror, fearing any sign of sympathy for the Jacques would bring ruin upon their own homes. Yet in the midst of the horror, the core truth of the Jacquerie remained. This was not a rebellion for glory or riches, but an eruption of unbearable suffering. The rebels fought not as an army, but as a people pushed beyond the limits of endurance. For many, death at the hands of the nobles was preferable to the slow, grinding death they had already been living. Their uprising was brief, lasting barely 2 months, but its impact would haunt France for generations. The nobility, once shaken, emerged more vicious and paranoid than before. Laws grew harsher. Surveillance increased. Any sign of unrest was met with disproportionate force. The word Jacquerie itself became a warning, whispered in fear by those who remembered what happened to the villages that dared to rise. Still, beneath the surface, nothing was truly healed. The peasants returned to their fields, planting new crops in earth stained with the blood of neighbors and kin. The manors were rebuilt, often with the forced labor of survivors. But a crack had opened in the old order, a wound that would never fully close. Every noble knew in some secret chamber of the heart that the peasants had tasted the possibility of resistance, and that such fury, once unleashed, could never be wholly extinguished. As for the Jacques, they vanished into the mists of history. Their names were forgotten, erased by the victors, but their story lingered as a shadow behind every harvest, every tax demand, every injustice. The Jacquerie was not the last peasant uprising, far from it. But it was among the bloodiest, the most shattering, the most revealing of the cruel engine that powered medieval society. It exposed the myth that peasants were merely passive, voiceless masses. For a brief, blazing moment, they became the terror of the land, reminding even the highest lords that those at the bottom could, when pushed too far, drag all of society into chaos and fire. In the end, the Jacquerie was a tragedy without heroes, a warning written in blood. It stands as a testament to what happens when a people are stripped of hope, when suffering becomes the only language left. Its lesson echoes through centuries, that there is a breaking point for every system, and that when the powerless rise, the response of power is almost always more brutal than any dream of freedom. The fields of northern France, now peaceful, still remember. And every harvest, somewhere in the quiet rustle of wheat, the ghost of the Jacques stirs, a reminder that history's silence is always temporary, and that even the meek in their desperation can shake the world. When the plague returned in the middle of the war, the year is 1361. France is still bleeding from the 100 Years' War. Fields are scorched, villages gutted, and families already reeling from famine and violence. But as soldiers march and arrows fall, a much older enemy creeps back across the land, a killer more terrifying than any army. The Black Death, that unseeable, inescapable force that just a decade ago shattered half of Europe, returns in the midst of war, striking with a savagery the survivors had almost convinced themselves they'd never see again. There's no warning. In some remote village, a child coughs blood, a woman collapses in the fields, her body swollen with purple boils. News spreads not by word, but by silence. Entire hamlets vanish overnight. The first wave of the plague, back in the late 1340s, had already hollowed out the countryside. Graves lined the fields, towns lost half their people. The survivors, gaunt, traumatized, clinging to the edge of life, had tried to rebuild. But they lived in fear, haunted by memories of how quickly death had come before. Now, as mercenaries trample the land and lords demand impossible taxes, that fear becomes reality. The pestilence rides again. No one is prepared. Not the nobles who believed God had finished punishing them, nor the peasants who still prayed for mercy each night. The war itself is chaos. Bands of armed men roam the roads. Law breaks down. Refugees clog the villages. When the plague strikes, it finds a population already broken, their bodies weak from hunger, their spirits battered by loss. Doctors, those who remain, are helpless. Monks with their incense, physicians with their beaked masks, all are powerless. The treatments that failed before fail again. Bleeding, herbs, prayers, amulets. Most people simply shut their doors and hope the horror passes by. But the disease does not respect walls or pleas. It spreads through the air, through touch, through nothing at all but the will of fate. Some villages lose every last soul within days. Horses run loose in empty lanes. Grain rots in the field, for there are no hands left to harvest it. Imagine the terror. You hear distant weeping, then silence. You step outside and see smoke on the horizon, another village burning its dead. Parents are forced to bury their own children, then collapse beside the graves, feverish, and doom themselves. Priests stop ringing the church bells because there are no more funerals, only mass graves. Sometimes there aren't even enough survivors left to dig them. The war, which once seemed all-consuming, becomes background noise to the relentless march of disease. Soldiers, cramped in their camps, fall just as quickly as the peasants they once hunted. Nobles retreat to distant manors, but the rats and fleas find them anyway. There's nowhere to hide. Chroniclers write that in some areas, up to half the population vanishes again. Families disappear from memory, entire bloodlines gone in a single summer. Markets collapse. Trade routes shrivel, for who would dare cross a land where death walks invisible? Fields are abandoned. The countryside, already stripped bare by armies, now grows wild. Wolves prowl where children once played. The few who remain look haunted, starving, suspicious of strangers. Many believe this is the end of the world, a second punishment for a sinful, warring land. But there are darker stories. People, driven mad by fear and hunger, accuse their neighbors of witchcraft or poisoning wells. Some lash out, looting abandoned homes, desperate for anything: food, silver, a scrap of hope. Others retreat into fanaticism, flagellants marching through ruined towns, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of appeasing God. All the while, the war does not stop. Kings and captains plan new battles, as if the living are still enough to fight. What's left in the aftermath is a land nearly emptied. Entire regions have more graves than living souls. The survivors are changed, harder, more suspicious, haunted by losses they cannot name. For decades to come, the memory of the returning plague lingers in every ruined farmhouse, every untended field. Villages that vanished are never rebuilt. Stories are told of places where no birds sing, no crops grow, haunted by ghosts of those who died not by sword or arrow, but by breath, by touch, by fate. Yet even here, life does not end. Over time, the few who remain gather, plant new crops, and carve new crosses. The war grinds on, but its armies are shadows of what they once were. The plague's return has left a mark deeper than any battle, a scar in the earth, in memory, in the very bones of Europe. And in the silence that follows, as bells ring once more in empty churches, the survivors know that nothing will ever be as it was before. Death has passed twice, and only the hardest, luckiest, or most desperate are left to remember. The world keeps moving, but in these haunted fields, the echo of that second black visitation endures. Every new cough is a cause for fear. Every dark cloud on the horizon might bring death again. And so the living cling to each other, to faith, to superstition, to whatever hope remains in a land shaped by war and scarred forever by plague. Peasants were taxed to fund a war they never wanted. Imagine you are a peasant living in the shadow of war. Your life is not about glory, but about survival, each day measured by the sweat on your brow, the pain in your back, and the weight of what little you have managed to save for your family. You have never seen a king. You barely understand the borders that armies are dying for. But one thing is certain: every year the cost of their wars lands, brutally on your doorstep. It begins with the tax collector. He is not a knight in shining armor, nor a villain you can fight. He's just another man from the city, riding into your village with a ledger, an escort of soldiers, and orders signed by a distant monarch. He doesn't care about the blight on your wheat or the sickness that took your cow. He has quotas to meet. The king needs more silver, more grain, more livestock, for armor, for weapons, for the endless campaigns that rage across muddy fields you will never see. This isn't a single event, but a grinding, inescapable process. You already give a tenth of your harvest to the church, a share to the local lord, and now the crown demands even more. The taille. In France, the 15th and 10th in England. Each new levy is announced with solemn words, draped in the language of duty, patriotism, or divine will. But all you hear is the toll it takes on your life. A man with a badge, backed by swords, counting your chickens, weighing your sacks of barley, tallying up what must be given, right now or else. Your children watch as the best of your food is loaded into carts and rolled away. You pray that the grain left behind will last the winter. There is no compensation, no promise that what you give will come back. The king's armies march, but the king's peasants starve, and still the war drags on. In Paris and London, monarchs plot strategies, negotiate alliances, and boast of future victories. The victories, when they come, are paid for in blood and in your hunger. The nobles who fight in gleaming armor, the kings who sign treaties, never worry about a missed meal. But in the villages, hunger gnaws at hope. Your neighbor, old Bernard, gave his last goat last autumn. This spring, his family begs at the crossroads. Your wife weeps at night, counting dwindling stores and wondering how to stretch them through one more hungry season. Each time the king needs more, when a siege is lost, when a new army is raised, when new armor or weapons must be paid for, the tacksmen return. Sometimes they take what you cannot give, the last sow, the seed corn meant for next year, a blanket from your child's bed. If you hide anything, you risk everything. There are punishments for cheating the crown, and examples are made. A neighbor found guilty might be flogged, imprisoned, or his house burned as a warning. The fear of tax collectors is worse than the fear of the enemy army, for the enemy might never come, but taxes always do. You hear stories of peasants in other villages, forced to flee their homes when they could not pay, of children left orphaned by starvation or disease. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, the village priest preaches about patience and faith, but even he feels the loss. His tithe shrinks as your poverty deepens. You begin to realize the cruelty of the system. The people who die in war are not only those killed in battle, but the thousands who die quietly, forgotten in their homes, starved by the needs of kings. The war becomes a machine, grinding up not only soldiers, but the very foundations of village life. Fields go untended, homes fall into ruin, the sick go without care, because all the resources flow to a cause no peasant ever chose. The weight of taxation becomes a tool of control. You know you are powerless. If you rebel, you risk everything, your life, your family, your village. Sometimes, in desperation, peasants rise up, as they did in France with the Jacquerie or in England with the Peasants' Revolt. But these uprisings are crushed. The punishment is swift and merciless. Heads are placed on spikes, and taxes are raised higher still to pay for the soldiers needed to restore order. And yet you endure. Your ancestors endured. Survival becomes an act of quiet rebellion. You learn to hide a little extra grain in the thatch, to keep a chicken or two out of sight, to stretch a meal just a bit further. But the fear never leaves you. When a royal messenger appears on the horizon, hearts sink. When strangers arrive in the night, you wonder if it's soldiers, tacksmen, or outlaws, each as hungry as you are, each as dangerous. You dream of a world without war, a world where what you grow is yours to keep, where children do not cry from hunger, where hope can grow alongside the barley. But as long as kings quarrel, as long as banners clash on distant fields, the burden will fall on your shoulders. You are the invisible backbone of the kingdom, the fuel for its ambitions, the victim of its victories and its defeats. Decades pass. The faces of kings change, the names of battles fade, but the tax continues, relentless as the turning seasons. You wonder if anything will ever change, if anyone will ever care about the pain behind those numbers in the royal ledger. You wonder if, centuries from now, someone will remember the nameless peasants who paid for the glory of kings, with the only thing they had left to give. The time French peasants were forced to house enemy soldiers. In the chaos of medieval France, The greatest terror did not always come from the battlefield, but from the sudden arrival of strangers in uniform, uninvited guests whose boots trampled your fields and whose appetites devoured your meager stores. Imagine a dusk where the sound of distant hooves sends chills through an entire village. You know what's coming before you see them. Enemy soldiers, men fresh from pillaging a neighboring town, faces streaked with the soot of burning homes and the cold confidence of killers who have already chosen survival over mercy. There's no escape, because in this age, peasants are not just victims of war, but pawns trapped between armies. To refuse hospitality is to court disaster. And so you open your door to the very men who might have slaughtered your friends. It is the 14th century, and France is a land battered by endless war. The 100 Years' War and countless feudal skirmishes have carved the countryside into a patchwork of fear. For ordinary peasants, the threat is not some distant king's ambition. It is the sudden, daily horror of occupation. Lords and armies move like storms, seizing what they wish, vanishing just as quickly, leaving only broken bodies and empty homes. When soldiers arrive, they do not ask, they demand. Your hearth becomes theirs. Your bread, hoarded for winter, is thrown into their stew. The bed your children sleep in becomes a filthy nest for boots and blades. If you are lucky, your family survives the night. If not, they may vanish without a trace, swept away by violence as random as a lightning strike. The system even had a name: billeting, the legal right for armies to force civilians to provide room and board. In theory, this was meant to keep armies fed and rested as they moved through friendly or enemy lands. But in practice, it was legalized theft and psychological torture. Picture a troop of a dozen men, many of them little more than mercenaries, tired and hungry, laughing at your fear. They slam their swords into your table to stake their claim. You bring out your best cheese and bread because you know that holding back, or even hesitating, is a gamble with your life. If the food runs out, so do your chickens. If there's nothing left to give, they may take your daughter, your tools, even the roof from above your head. There are stories, passed down in whispers, of peasants who tried to hide or escape, only to be dragged into the road and beaten so badly they never walked again. And still the law and the Lord would side with the soldiers. The horror didn't end with a single night. Sometimes the occupation lasted days, even weeks. Every sunrise meant new demands, new humiliations. Soldiers who were supposed to be your guests might turn on you in an instant. Your home was no longer your own. Your privacy, your dignity, your very sense of safety were erased. And always there was the threat of retaliation. If anyone in the village resisted, if a single soldier was found dead, or even went missing, the entire community could be punished. Houses burned, livestock slaughtered, children orphaned. So the peasants learned to obey, to swallow their rage and grief, to keep their heads down. The strongest would sleep with a knife under their mattress, not to attack, but as a last desperate defense. What made it worse was that these weren't always foreign enemies. France's wars blurred every line. Sometimes the soldiers were English, sometimes Burgundians, sometimes even Frenchmen, loyal to a rival lord. For peasants, the uniform was less important than the violence that followed it. Today's enemy could be tomorrow's protector, and loyalty meant nothing to those who starved. There are heartbreaking stories of families who, after surviving one group of marauders, were forced to serve another and another, each time giving up what little they had left, each time watching the world grow colder, more brutal, more hopeless. And yet, through all of this, the resilience of the peasants was almost superhuman. Mothers would hide scraps of food for their children, even as they handed over their best to the invaders. Fathers would rebuild what was destroyed, patching roofs and fences by moonlight, because to give up was to die. Communities would share news in secret, warning neighbors of troop movements, sheltering orphans and fugitives, keeping hope alive in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Some priests risked everything to speak for their flock, though more often the church turned a blind eye, caught between its own fear and its ties to power. But there were moments of open defiance, flashes of rage that history almost lost. In rare cases, whole villages banded together to fight back, ambushing small groups of soldiers, poisoning food, setting traps on lonely roads. The consequences were terrible, but sometimes it was better to die on your feet than to live forever in terror. Most of the time, though, the rebellion was silent. A look, a refusal to weep, the simple act of surviving one more night with your family intact. Peasants became masters of endurance, experts in suffering, forced by history into roles they never chose. When the soldiers finally left, they left little behind but misery. Storerooms were empty, walls scarred by blades and fists, the village population forever changed. Sometimes the only trace of what had happened was a burned field or a missing face at the morning meal. Life went on, because it had to, but nothing was ever the same. Every future rumor of war, every distant drum, sent shock waves of dread through the countryside. Generations grew up haunted by memories of that terrible hospitality, when strangers with weapons became your lords for a night, a week, or however long they chose to stay. This is the hidden reality of medieval war, the pain and terror written not in the chronicles of kings, but in the shattered families and stolen harvests of the poor. The stories of forced hospitality, of peasants feeding and sheltering their enemies, are not tales of kindness, but of survival at its cruelest edge. They remind us that history is never just about battles and banners. It is about the homes destroyed in their wake, the mothers who gave away the last loaf of bread to save a child's life, the fathers who stood guard in darkness, powerless to protect what mattered most. Behind every victory march and royal treaty, there are untold thousands whose lives were broken so that others might rule. And so, when you hear the echoes of war in old tales, remember those whose only crime was being born in the path of armies, those who opened their doors to the enemy not because they wanted to, but because history left them no choice. The English longbowmen who took peasant ears as trophies. The myth of the English longbowmen is one of legend, heroes of Agincourt, silent shadows in the mist, skilled hands raining arrows with inhuman precision. But peel back the romantic stories of gallant archers, and you'll find a different face of history. In the chaos of medieval war, the longbowmen did not just win battles. Sometimes they left behind a legacy of terror, one measured not in victories, but in the grisly trophies they carried, the ears and noses of peasants caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Picture a dawn raid on a French village. The only warning is the crack of a burning roof, the sudden shriek of a rooster, the thud of boots against wet earth. English archers, faces streaked with sweat and mud, swarm through the fog. For peasants, there is nowhere to hide. In the eyes of the English, the villagers are not civilians, but resources, problems to be solved, examples to be made. When resistance is met, or even suspected, there's no room for mercy. Some archers, hardened by years of brutal campaigning, carry sharp knives alongside their bows. Captured peasants, pleading for their lives, become messages. A swift cut, a scream quickly stifled. An ear or a nose, crudely severed, is held aloft as proof of a lesson taught, a warning to others who might think to resist, shelter enemies, or refuse to pay. This was not mindless savagery. It was calculated violence. Medieval warfare was as much about psychology as about strength. Fear is a weapon, and the English longbowmen wielded it with chilling efficiency. Word spread from farm to farm, town to town. If you saw the English banners on the horizon, you faced a choice: run, surrender, or risk losing more than your livestock. Parents hushed their children, telling them to keep silent, to stay low, to never look a soldier in the eyes. The mutilation of peasants was both warning and punishment. Sometimes it was retaliation, villages suspected of hiding enemy soldiers or refusing supplies. Sometimes it was arbitrary, the act of men numbed by endless killing, needing to remind the land itself who held the power. After a raid, a grisly collection of ears or noses might be strung on a cord, displayed to commanding officers as proof of a job done, or hung at the gates as a sign for the next village. The archers themselves were often recruited from England's poorest classes. They were tough, pragmatic, and lived by strict codes, but in war, even codes can bend. Some relished the brutality, others simply obeyed orders. To the commanders, each mutilated ear was evidence of effective terror. To the victims, it was a wound that would never heal, a constant reminder of helplessness in the face of unstoppable force. Survivors bore their scars in silence. A missing ear was not just disfigurement. It marked you for life. The mutilated were shunned, sometimes pitied, sometimes feared, as bearers of a curse. In markets and fields, people turned away, unable to meet the gaze of those who had become living warnings. Children grew up with stories of the English, tales whispered at night of men who came not just to conquer, but to mutilate. The psychological impact of these tactics rippled far beyond the immediate victims. News of the atrocities traveled on the tongues of refugees, traders, and wandering priests. Entire regions could be paralyzed by rumor alone. Villages abandoned at the first hint of English approach, fields left unharvested, resistance melting before it could ever begin. Brutality bought results. The English campaigners, outnumbered and far from home, found that terror could break the enemy faster than any sword. Yet beneath the tactics, the violence, the cold logic of war, there remained something raw and human. Some archers, it said, came to regret what they had done. In taverns and after battles, haunted by memories, they drank heavily, trying to wash away the blood and the screams. Others became numb, their hearts calcified by the repetition of cruelty. The cost of fear is always paid in the minds of those who wield it, as well as those who suffer. Medieval chroniclers record the mutilations almost in passing, as if such horrors were simply part of the landscape, no more noteworthy than the changing seasons. But for those who lived through it, each act of violence echoed for generations. Villages rebuilt, families mourned, and in every peasant face the trauma of survival was written deep and permanent. When we remember the Longbowmen, let us not just see the archer poised on the field of Agincourt, but also the shadow he casts, long, sharp, and dark, across the lives of those who had no power but to endure. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval war, every ear, every nose was a message, that survival itself could be a form of resistance, and that the true legacy of conquest is measured not just in land, but in the scars left behind on human flesh and memory. When famine and war turned peasants into cannibals, the old chronicles whisper of years when Europe's green fields turned black with hunger, and the thin line between survival and damnation snapped in the jaws of famine. In the shadow of endless war, when armies trampled crops and every horizon burned, a darkness descended that went beyond the sword. It was the kind of hunger that haunted the bones. In the mid-14th century, war and famine were not isolated disasters. They were married, each fueling the other's cruelty. In the chaos of the 100 Years' War, the French countryside became a crucible where bodies and souls were tested beyond their limits. Roads that once carried grain and hope now echoed with the march of soldiers or the thunder of hooves. Raiders who cared nothing for harvests or homes, only plunder. Trade stopped. Seed went unsown. Fields lay abandoned, ruined by war horses, or torched in scorched earth campaigns designed to break the enemy but dooming the peasants, trapped in between. The people of the land, peasants who worked from sunup to sundown, were the first to suffer. They were born into hardship, but what came in the great famines of the 14th century was something far beyond even their darkest expectations. The earth itself seemed to turn against them. Rain came at the wrong times or not at all. Frost killed what little hope sprouted in the mud. Those who had animals found them stolen by soldiers or dead of disease. Starvation is slow, but it's relentless. It strips away dignity first, then health, then the mind. Bread became rare, then disappeared. Chestnuts, acorns, roots, anything edible was fought over, guarded, stolen. There were no stores to raid, no relief caravans from the king. Each village was an island, surrounded by the smoke of distant burning and the silent, encroaching shadow of winter. The chronicles, often written by priests or monks not prone to exaggeration, record what happened next in tones of horror. In the worst-hit areas, cannibalism crept in like a nightmare that refused to end at dawn. At first it was whispered about, old stories of what the others might do in some other, more desperate place. But then the truth broke through the walls of shame. In villages cut off by war, where no carts came with grain, where fields yielded only stones, the unthinkable became a matter of survival. People ate what they could. Dead animals, leather from old shoes, boiled weeds, bark from trees. When even these ran out, the eyes turned inward. There are records from the time scribbled in the margins of abbey ledgers, chronicling bodies found mutilated, children gone missing, the dead disappearing from shallow graves at the edge of the forest. Some stories speak of parents driven mad by hunger, of neighbors watching each other not as friends, but as the last desperate resource. It was not an evil born of choice, but of absolute necessity, a breaking of the human spirit that occurred only when every other door had been closed and locked by fate. One account from 1315, during the great famine that swept Europe before the Black Death, described families driven to such despair that they devoured the flesh of children, of the dead, and in some monstrous cases, of the living. The 100 Years' War took this already haunted landscape and made it worse. Armies deliberately destroyed food supplies to starve the enemy, but it was always the peasants, not the princes, who paid the price. Sometimes soldiers besieging a town would intercept anyone trying to bring in food, killing the bearers or forcing them to abandon their cargo. Once a French chronicler described a besieged city where the citizens, starved past the point of reason, boiled the bodies of the dead and gnawed on bones in the hope of staving off the hunger that burned inside them. Another story, recorded decades later, told of entire hamlets where no living person remained except for one, caught at last, devouring the remains of the neighbors who had fallen before him. What's most chilling is how the horror of cannibalism lingered in the cultural memory, spoken about only in hushed tones for centuries. Those who survived never forgot what they had done or what they had witnessed. Shame became a second skin, tighter and heavier than any winter cloak. Villages that had resorted to cannibalism became pariahs, their names changed or wiped from the maps, the past buried with the bones of those they had consumed. Survivors passed the stories down, not as confessions, but as warnings, that there are places in this world where the human mind, under unbearable pressure, can break and turn against its own kind. Yet, for all the horror, there is a grim truth at the heart of these tales. Cannibalism was never chosen lightly, never without tears and prayers and the collapse of every other hope. It was the last surrender, the final act of a people cornered by forces far beyond their control. The lords and kings who fought their endless wars rarely saw the starving faces that watched them ride by. For the nobility, famine was a political inconvenience. For the peasant, it was the end of the world, repeated winter after winter, with no end in sight. And when spring finally came, when war moved on, or grain returned, life resumed with a terrible silence. No one spoke of what had happened during the long nights. Fields were replanted. Graves were dug deeper. The cycle began again. But in the haunted look of survivors, in the reluctance to trust strangers, in the new superstitions and the old wounds that never truly healed, The mark of famine remained. The stories faded, but the lesson did not. That civilization is fragile, and that under the right pressure, even the most ordinary people can be pushed past the boundaries of what it means to be human. It is easy from a distance to judge the peasants of those terrible winters. But standing in the ruins of their villages, with nothing left but the ache of hunger and the sound of war growing closer, one truth becomes painfully clear. There are places in history where survival demanded everything, even the last shreds of innocence. The famine years, the war years, were not just a collapse of order. They were a collapse of the human contract, an unraveling of everything people promised to each other in better times. In the end, these stories are not just about hunger or war, but about the terrifying places the mind can go when every light is extinguished, and winter never ends. The village that disappeared overnight. After a mercenary raid, they came in the night before the world had even begun to stir. No warning, just the sudden thunder of hooves, the crunch of boots, and the crackle of flames. In the heart of rural France, amid fields battered by war and villages exhausted by famine, a new terror stalked the darkness. The routiers. These mercenaries, men once paid by kings and nobles to fight their wars, had become a scourge upon the land, unpaid and ungoverned, hunting for survival and spoils. For them, the villages of the countryside were nothing more than targets, stores of grain, sources of gold, and living witnesses to be silenced. This is the story of one such village, a place whose name is now lost to history, because after that night, it simply ceased to exist. The villagers had heard rumors, tales of bands of hardened men, armored but ragged, drifting through the valleys, their loyalty belonging to whoever offered coin, or if no coin came, to themselves. Sometimes they flew the banners of the English, sometimes the French, but more often they were loyal only to hunger and violence. No one knew when they would come, or if, but all knew what it meant if they did. That evening, life in the village went on as it always had. The fields had yielded little, but supper was shared around smoky fires, children's laughter mixing with the distant calls of night birds. But outside the circle of warmth in the shadows beyond the last cottage, death was gathering. The routiers, perhaps 24, perhaps more, watched and waited. Hardened by war, they moved like wolves, communicating with gestures, the moon glinting off their battered weapons. The attack was sudden, merciless. Doors splintered under booted feet. Men and boys, unarmed and desperate, tried to defend their homes, but most stood no chance. Swords rose and fell in the candlelight, red splattering the packed earth floors. Those who resisted died quickly. Those who fled were hunted down, screams swallowed by the night. The routiers showed no mercy. They smashed furniture, tore apart cupboards, and overturned cradles in their search for food, silver, and anything else of value. When they found none, they set the cottages alight. Straw roofs went up in seconds, flames leaping from house to house. Smoke poured skyward, carrying with it the last hopes of the village. Some villagers hid in root cellars or barns, clutching children to their chests, praying to saints who could not hear them. But the mercenaries had seen it all before. They pried open doors, set barns on fire, and dragged the terrified out into the open. Old men begged for mercy. Women were left sobbing on the ground. Those taken captive were forced to reveal hidden stores, grain, salt, sometimes a few battered coins. Most of these prizes would not save their lives. By dawn nothing remained but ashes and silence. The routiers, their sacks filled, their anger spent, vanished into the mist, seeking another village, another night. The air hung heavy with the stink of burned wood and blood. The fields, once filled with the sound of life, were now eerily silent, broken only by the distant caw of crows. When, days later, travelers or officials arrived, they found nothing but blackened ruins. There were no survivors to tell the story, only bodies, contorted and scorched, scattered among the collapsed walls. Chickens ran wild, dogs howled at the empty air. In the nearby woods, perhaps a single child, driven half-mad by terror, watched from the shadows, unable to move or speak. But soon, even these memories would fade. On the official rolls, the village simply disappeared. Land once farmed became wild again, the boundaries forgotten. Its name was lost, unmarked on any map. People from neighboring settlements would glance at the ruined site and cross themselves, whispering prayers as they hurried past. Some said the ground was cursed, haunted by the souls of the innocent. Others simply tried to forget. But in the minds of those who survived elsewhere, the lesson was clear. No one was safe. Across France, this nightmare was repeated hundreds of times. The routiers, skilled at war and desperate in peace, became an ever-present shadow. Kings condemned them, but neither side could control or pay them. As the war dragged on and famine deepened, their numbers grew. Even nobles, if they lacked the gold to hire their own guards, sometimes fell victim. The devastation wrought by these mercenary raids went deeper than the flames. It tore apart the fragile fabric of rural life, sowing mistrust and fear. Villagers learned to mistrust strangers, to hide what little they had, to sleep lightly and pray for protection. Some communities banded together to build crude defenses or paid tribute to passing bands of mercenaries, hoping to buy a night's peace. Others simply gave up, fleeing to the relative safety of walled towns, if those towns would even let them in. For decades, entire swaths of the French countryside were marked by abandoned farms and silent ruins. Maps from the era show whole clusters of villages that vanished within a single generation. The scars of these routier raids lingered for centuries, stories passed down, lessons never fully forgotten. All that remains of the village that vanished is the silence, the stories half remembered, the blackened stones overgrown by weeds. But for one night, in the middle of a war without end, the line between order and chaos was erased completely. It was not armies or kings who decided the fate of that village, but hunger, violence, and the ruthlessness of men with nothing left to lose. This is how history sometimes moves, not in great battles or famous decrees, but in the quiet erasure of a place no one remembers. A village gone, swallowed up by darkness, leaving behind only fear and the chilling knowledge that, on a night like any other, everything can be lost. The baby-killing myth that justified massacres. Imagine a world where a rumor is as deadly as a sword, where the whisper of a crime, unproven and unthinkable, can seal the fate of an entire community, where the story spreads like wildfire, impossible to stop, feeding on fear and prejudice. In medieval Europe, this wasn't just a nightmare. It was a strategy, a weapon of control. The myth that peasants, in their anger, would murder the innocent children of nobles wasn't born out of truth, but out of terror. And once unleashed, it became an excuse for horrors almost too much to imagine. You are a peasant in a time of famine and oppression. Your daily life is a struggle against hunger, disease, the cruelty of your overlord, and the whims of fate. When taxes rise again, when another war breaks over the horizon, when the soldiers march through your fields and take what little you have left, desperation grows. Sometimes anger boils over, peasants revolt, tools become weapons, and for a moment the world feels like it might turn upside down. But the ruling class, the barons, the knights, the lords who have held power for generations, have always known how to maintain control. They do not fight only with steel, but with stories. The most terrifying story of all is that, in their rage, peasants are capable of anything, even the murder of noble babies. It begins with a single accusation. After a brutal uprising, a noblewoman is found dead, her infant gone. No evidence, no witness, only the charred remains of a manor house and the hysterical testimony of survivors desperate to explain what happened. Soon the rumors grow. In village after village, the same story is told. Peasants didn't just burn the lord's home, they killed his children in their cradles. The tale spreads, not because it's true, but because it justifies what is about to come. Nobles ride into villages with banners waving and swords drawn, not as executioners, but as avengers. Their anger is righteous, their violence sanctified. They do not come to judge, but to punish. The law is set aside. Who needs a trial for monsters who would murder infants? Entire communities are swept away in the name of vengeance. Men are cut down in the fields, women and children driven into the woods, homes put to the torch. The air fills with smoke and the screams of the innocent. For those on the receiving end, there is no hope. You cannot argue with a myth. The accusation alone is enough to condemn you and everyone you love. There are no courts, no appeals, no chance to prove your innocence. Your only crime is being in the wrong place at the wrong time, while a story larger than yourself is written in blood. This is the dark genius of the baby-killing myth. It turns ordinary people into monsters in the eyes of those in power. It feeds on existing prejudices, the belief that peasants are brutish, impulsive, and dangerous when enraged. The myth echoes older, deeper fears, that the lower classes, the outsiders, the desperate and hungry, are always on the edge of savagery. Once that belief takes root, no atrocity against them seems too extreme. Sometimes the myth becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Under the threat of annihilation, with nothing left to lose, the most desperate peasants might indeed lash out, not because of some ancient hatred, but because their world is collapsing. But most of the time, the accusation is a lie, crafted by those who need a reason to spill blood without remorse. Look at the chronicles of the Middle Ages. Again and again in France, in Germany, in England, after every major peasant uprising, from the Jacquerie to the English peasants' revolt, there is a pattern. A massacre followed by stories of unspeakable peasant crimes. No proof, no bodies found, only the smoke rising from the ruins of a village and a story told by those who survived the massacre, their own hands still stained with blood. Even centuries later, historians struggle to untangle the truth. Was there ever a peasant revolt that ended with the killing of a noble baby? If so, it was vanishingly rare. What is certain is that the myth endured, repeated in songs and sermons, carved into the memory of a fearful nobility. The myth did its work. It justified not only violence, but the preservation of a rigid social order. Imagine being a child in one of those villages, watching your home burn because of something you never did, something no one you know ever did. Imagine the silence that falls after the soldiers leave, the way survivors gather to bury their dead, whispering prayers to a God who must surely have turned away. Imagine knowing that your very existence can be erased by a story someone else wants to believe. This is how power protects itself, not with justice but with myth, not with law but with legend. It is the ultimate betrayal, to be slaughtered not for what you have done, but for what you have become in the imagination of those above you. And this betrayal is not just personal, but generational. The survivors carry the shame, the fear, the anger. They teach their children to be silent, to keep their heads down, to mistrust the world outside their own village. A wound like this never heals, it festers, poisoning the soul of a nation. And yet the myth persists, because it is useful, because it can be revived whenever power feels threatened, because it asks no proof, only belief. Today, it seems unbelievable, impossible even, that such a thing could happen. But the lesson is written in blood and ashes. Beware the stories told by those in power, especially when they are used to justify the suffering of the powerless. Because in the end, a lie told often enough can become deadlier than any sword. When the war crossed borders, and so did the terror. There are places in history where the borders on the map dissolve into something far more terrifying, a no-man's land where the rules of civilization crumble and ordinary people become the playthings of war. In medieval Gascony, on the edge between French and English control, peasants lived with one certainty. When armies clashed, the boundaries of mercy faded. The fields were scarred by marching boots, the villages haunted by the sound of distant hooves, and every sunrise could bring death, not for something you'd done, but for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Imagine waking to a sky bruised with smoke, the air thick with the scent of burnt grain. You hear shouts in two languages, sometimes English, sometimes French, sometimes a dialect twisted by years of occupation and resistance. These voices are not those of liberators or protectors. They are soldiers hunting for traitors, for spies, for anyone to blame when fortunes turn sour. But in truth, there are no traitors here, just peasants caught between two enemies who both see them as potential collaborators. In these contested borderlands, suspicion is the harvest that grows best. One day, French soldiers ride into your hamlet, accusing you of feeding the English, demanding to know why the enemy is so well supplied. They beat men in the square, drag women from their homes, and when the answers are not good enough, the punishments are swift and brutal. A hanging in the apple orchard, a farmhouse set alight with everyone inside. The lesson is clear. Loyalty is expected, but loyalty is a lie. Tomorrow the English come, and they bring the same accusations. Why are there no French dead in the road? Who warned the villagers of our arrival? The same families, battered and broken, are forced to prove their innocence to a new set of masters, each more violent than the last. The lines on the map mean nothing to the hungry, the cold, the grieving. Gascony's peasants were neither French nor English. They were survivors, scraping a living from land that belonged to whoever held a sword to their throat that month. The harvest went to whoever collected taxes first. Allegiances shifted in the dust, not out of betrayal, but desperation. Children learned to keep silent. Women wept in private, burying the memories of husbands and sons taken as examples. Even priests, sworn to mercy, sometimes looked away when the next execution was carried out on church steps. The stories of these massacres rarely make it into the grand narratives of history, but in the mud and ash they became legend. One old chronicle tells of a village where every man above the age of 12 was hung from the same tree, accused by one side of hiding English scouts, then by the other of harboring French fugitives. In another, women who had nursed wounded soldiers, sometimes at sword point, were branded as traitors and burned alive. No trial, no mercy, just the swift erasure of anyone suspected of split loyalties. But what does loyalty mean when the very idea of a nation is being drawn and redrawn with every passing season? This was the true terror of border war. The enemy was not only on the other side of the field, but on every road, in every forest, sometimes wearing a familiar face. Neighbors were forced to inform on one another to save themselves. Children were pressed to reveal who had taken bread to which camp, whose barn sheltered which fugitives. The violence was not just physical, but psychological, a slow, grinding destruction of trust, of community, of hope. With every execution, every burned village, the message echoed, "Your life means nothing in the shadow of war. You're guilty because you exist." There was no refuge in these times, not even in faith. Some churches became sanctuaries for a day, only to be stormed by soldiers who found evidence of collaboration in the shape of a loaf of bread or a bandaged wound. Monks and priests themselves were sometimes executed, accused of passing messages between enemy lines or hiding the condemned. The few who tried to resist, to plead for justice, became martyrs whose names soon faded, lost beneath new waves of violence, and so the peasants of Gascony and places like it became experts in survival, living each day as if it might be their last. They learned to speak carefully, to give nothing away. Some buried what little food they had, hiding it from both armies. Others fled to the forests, building temporary shelters and living as outlaws until the worst had passed. There are stories of entire families vanishing into the hills, leaving behind only scorched earth and the memory of screams. Their crime? To exist between two worlds at war, a place where mercy was just another casualty. Yet, through it all, life stubbornly continued. Fields were replanted, homes rebuilt, children born in secret, baptized in streams where blood had run only weeks before. The resilience of the border peasant was a quiet miracle, a refusal to be extinguished, even as the world conspired to erase them. Songs were sung at night, stories told by firelight, not of heroes or kings, but of survival, of loved ones lost, of the bitter wisdom earned when you have seen both armies come and go, leaving only grief in their wake. When the historians write of borders and treaties, of shifting allegiances and conquests, remember the forgotten millions trapped in between, the people whose only crime was to stand on land that two empires claimed as their own. Their suffering was not a side note, but the foundation on which centuries of power were built. The border war's true legacy is not just in the maps, but in the haunted silence of villages erased, in the faces of those who endured terror from every direction, and in the lessons that remain. In war, innocence is the first victim, and survival is the only resistance left. The French peasant spy who was boiled alive. In the shivering dawn of medieval France, before the bells rang for Mass and the marketplace filled with voices, a different kind of gathering began. The air was thick with dread, a silent electricity running through the cobbled streets. Word had spread. There would be an execution, but not by sword or gallows. Something far worse. A peasant was to be boiled alive. Even for an age of routine cruelty, this was horror on a new scale. And all of it, the pain, the spectacle, the lesson, was for one reason: to punish a spy and terrify the world into obedience. The victim was no nobleman or soldier. He was a farmer, known to neighbors as a quiet, unremarkable man who worked the land and loved his family. But the 100 Years' War was everywhere, and suspicion grew like weeds. The English and the French played a deadly game of intelligence, with spies planted in villages and farms. Sometimes it was as simple as relaying which roads were clear, which bridges were guarded, which fields might feed an invading army. For this, a man could lose everything. Someone whispered his name to the authorities. Maybe it was envy, maybe it was a debt, or a rival seeking revenge. Maybe he was guilty, maybe not. But in the panic and paranoia of wartime, proof became a luxury no one could afford. The farmer was seized, dragged from his home, beaten, and interrogated by men who needed an example more than a confession. Under torture, the truth is often whatever the torturer wants to hear. The sentence was announced with chilling formality: public execution by boiling in oil, so that all might see and all might fear. In a time when hanging and beheading were everyday affairs, boiling was reserved for those whom authorities wanted not just to kill, but to erase, to turn the body itself into a warning, a weapon in the war against spies. The day arrived, and the square was transformed. In the center, a massive cauldron stood atop an iron grate. Beneath, a roaring fire. Soldiers forced the crowd to stand close, to witness every detail. Children clung to mothers. Old men remembered other executions, but none like this. The air was sharp with the smell of oil and burning wood, and with the stench of terror. Dragged in chains, the peasant was barely recognizable, face swollen from beatings, clothes torn and filthy. His eyes swept over the crowd, looking for mercy perhaps, or for a final glimpse of his family. There was none, only the eyes of neighbors, wide with fear, knowing that this could be them. In these moments a man is utterly alone. Chroniclers recorded what happened next with clinical horror. Soldiers forced the victim, still living, up a ladder to the rim of the cauldron. For a moment he hesitated, perhaps praying, perhaps begging. Then they pushed him, and he fell with a scream, lost in the crackle and pop of boiling oil. His body writhed, skin sloughing off, mouth open in a silent, endless cry. The crowd gasped, some fainted, some vomited, but no one looked away. The spectacle was too terrible, too hypnotic. This was the point. Fear must be imprinted on every soul. The execution lasted minutes that felt like hours. When it was done, the remains were fished out. No longer a man, but a symbol, a threat. The officials declared that this was justice, and anyone tempted to aid the enemy would meet the same fate. The crowd dispersed in numb silence, the sound of oil bubbling, lingering in their minds long after the square had emptied. But the terror didn't end with the execution. For weeks stories spread across the countryside. Mothers threatened unruly children with tales of the boiling. Farmers watched strangers with new suspicion. The lesson worked. For a while at least, spies became scarce, tongues wagged more cautiously, and everyone understood the message. No one, not even the humblest peasant, was safe from the war's insatiable hunger for blood and fear. Yet, beneath the official narrative, a quieter truth simmered. Some wept in private for the man who died so horribly. Some raged in secret at the cruelty of lords and kings who treated peasants as pawns. The trauma became a scar in village memory, a whispered legend, a warning, a nightmare passed from generation to generation. Centuries later, the chronicles still record his fate. Not his name, not his crimes, just the method, boiled alive. The details are blurred, the man forgotten, but the message endures. In the relentless machinery of medieval war, brutality was not an accident. It was a tactic sharpened to a fine, terrible point. A single peasant's agony became a lesson for thousands. The fear was the true weapon, and the crowd was always the real target. The 100 Years' War ended. Borders shifted, kings died, armies marched home. But in the memories of ordinary people, those who toiled in fields and dreamed only of peace, the story of the peasant who boiled in oil burned on, a nightmare never quite extinguished. And in that nightmare lies the true cost of power wielded without mercy, the suffering of the voiceless, transformed into a weapon to keep the world in line. The Church taxed the dying while preaching peace. In the depths of medieval Europe's darkest centuries, when war and pestilence stalked every road, a new kind of suffering descended, one that didn't arrive with the clash of armies, but with the soft tread of robed men bearing holy authority and an unyielding demand. The Church, that eternal symbol of hope and mercy, became for many a relentless collector, taxing even the dying, preaching peace while holding the keys to salvation for ransom. In an age where God's mercy was supposed to be infinite, forgiveness itself had a price, and those unable to pay risked losing not just their earthly goods, but their place in the world beyond. The 14th century was a crucible of misery for the common people of Europe. War, like the 100 Years' War, devoured villages, leaving blackened ruins where families once gathered. Plague swept through the land, turning streets into silent burial grounds. Crop failures, famine, and the ever-present threat of violence created a world in which survival was already a daily miracle. But even in this landscape of despair, the Church's tithe, the 1/10 owed by every soul, remained as rigid as stone. For the medieval peasant, the Church was everywhere and nowhere at once. Its teachings shaped every hour of the day, from the first morning bell to the last prayers at night. It was the source of comfort in fear, the promise of heaven after a life of toil. But this comfort came at a cost, one that was extracted with a firmness few dared question. The tithe was not a suggestion or an act of charity. It was law, believed to be the will of God Himself. Even in years when war or plague made survival almost impossible, the Church demanded its share: wheat, barley, coins, livestock, anything of value. And it was not enough to give what one could. It was required to give until it hurt. Priests moved from house to house, sometimes with clerks, sometimes with the Lord's men at their side, compiling lists and collecting what was due. The poor, the sick, even the dying were not exempt. Those who could not pay in coin or goods might find their last family possession, their only cloak, a cooking pot, even a portion of the meager food left for their children, taken in the name of spiritual duty. The reasoning was simple and terrible: salvation was too important to leave unpaid. Churchmen reminded the dying that the gates of heaven opened only for the righteous, and to deny the tithe was to risk eternal damnation. In some regions, if a villager failed to pay, their burial in consecrated ground could be denied. To die excommunicated, cast out from the Church's embrace, was a fate more feared than hunger or plague itself. The threat was not just spiritual. Records from England and France tell of priests arriving with armed escorts, men-at-arms ready to enforce the holy debt with sword or cudgel if need be. To resist was to resist both the Church and the local lord, as tithe and secular taxes often intertwined. A family grieving the loss of a father or mother might see the priest at their doorstep, ledger in hand, reminding them of what was owed to God before the grave could close. Even as mass graves filled with plague victims, the tithe was collected, and priests, immune to earthly suffering in the eyes of the law, made no exceptions for the horrors that surrounded them. Yet these same priests, from their pulpits, preached the virtues of peace and charity. Sermons rang out calling for compassion, for the wealthy to aid the poor, for brotherhood among all Christians. But behind these words lay the machinery of the medieval church, wealthy, powerful, and hungry for more. Cathedrals soared on the backs of the poor, built with coin extracted from starving hands. Monasteries grew fat, their storehouses bulging while villages withered just beyond their walls. In times of war, the church might preach against violence, but it was not above hiring mercenaries to collect what was due, nor did it hesitate to sell indulgences, forgiveness in advance, for those who could afford them. The contradiction was not lost on the people. In secret, resentment brewed. Some began to whisper that the church's holy men cared more for gold than for souls. In rare moments, this anger erupted into open defiance, a refusal to pay, a confrontation at a grave, a priest driven from the village. But such resistance was dangerous. Excommunication was not just a spiritual sentence, it was social death. The excommunicated lost legal protection, could not inherit, could not marry, could not be buried beside ancestors. For most, submission was the only option, no matter how unjust the demand. The church justified its actions with scripture and tradition. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. But to the peasant dying of plague, or the widow scraping mold from her last loaf of bread, it felt as though God's representatives were little different from the lords and kings who sent armies through their fields. When death finally came, many families faced a final indignity. The priest would not open the church doors for a funeral mass until debts were settled. Mourning and misery, grief and fear, all were tangled in the same cold calculation. In the centuries that followed, the memory of these times did not fade. The wealth and power of the medieval church, built on the backs of the poorest, became the fuel for revolution and reform. Voices rose in protest, from John Wycliffe in England, who denounced the church's greed, to the fires of the Reformation that would one day sweep Europe. But for the millions who lived and died in those cruel years, the wound was already deep. Today, the image of the medieval church is often softened by the glow of stained glass and the music of ancient hymns, but behind the beauty stands a history of contradiction and suffering. War and plague may have killed with sword and sickness, but the tithe extracted its own quiet toll, turning hope to resentment, charity to bitterness, and faith to fear. For many, the final lesson of those years was clear. Salvation, in this world at least, was never free, and the cost was often paid by those who had the least left to give. The woman who led her village in a last stand. In the rolling green hills of Dordogne, where rivers cut through forests and ancient stone villages cling to the earth like secrets, there once lived a woman whose name, if it was ever written, is now lost to time. She was not a noble nor a saint, but a peasant widow, one among thousands. Yet in a moment when darkness threatened to swallow her world, she did what neither lords nor armies had managed. She made a village stand together against terror, and she became legend. It began, as so many stories did in the 14th century, with fear. War raged across France, and as armies clashed far away, their aftermath washed over the countryside in waves of hunger and violence. Routiers, those marauding bands of mercenaries, stalked the land like hungry wolves. Villages heard rumors of slaughter. Entire hamlets burned, families butchered, women and children vanished in the night. Every dusk, mothers pulled their children close and prayed for the sun to rise again. She had lost her husband to the last bad winter, a fever, a cough, and then nothing but silence in the one-room cottage. She mourned as others did, with a stoic face and silent tears, because the world offered little comfort to widows. But as the head of her household, she worked harder than ever, guiding her sons, sharing what little she had with neighbors. To the villagers, she became a quiet source of strength, a woman whose courage was felt more than spoken. It was on an evening thick with summer heat that the warning came. A shepherd boy, breathless, ran from the ridge. He'd seen riders in the woods, not men from the nearest castle, not traders or pilgrims, but raiders, armed, armored, hungry for plunder, too close for escape. Panic swept the village. Some whispered of running to the hills, but there was no time. Others wanted to surrender, to beg for mercy. But the widow stood in the center of the square, her face hard in the firelight, and spoke with a calm that cut through the fear. "We have nothing left to give," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We can run, and they will hunt us. We can beg, and they will take what little we have, and more. Or we can stand. If we fight together, maybe we buy one another a chance. Maybe we write our own ending." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, one by one, men and women found their resolve. The blacksmith fetched iron rods. The baker broke his door for a club. Mothers armed their sons with pitchforks. Children ran messages. Even the old and frail, with trembling hands, piled stones near the village gate. It was a defense born not of hope, but of the knowledge that nothing else remained. She led them with the simple wisdom that hardship had taught her. Use what you have and trust the people beside you. The villagers blocked the narrow lane with carts and barrels, knowing the attackers would be forced to bunch together. They soaked cloths to douse fires. They placed the bravest men and women where the raiders would strike first, hiding the weak and the young in the chapel. When the routier finally arrived, they expected little resistance. They rode through the mist, torches high, shouting for surrender. The widow stood at the barricade, torch in hand, her children behind her. The first raider to leap the fence fell to her iron poker, a blow that echoed like thunder in the night. Others joined her, clubs and stones flying. The mercenaries, caught off guard by the fury and discipline of the defenders, fell back, then charged again. The battle that followed was brutal and desperate. The widow moved through the chaos like a storm, shouting orders, pulling the wounded to safety, driving the attackers back with a strength that seemed to come from the earth itself. The villagers fought as one, side by side, back to back, using every weapon, every scrap of courage. Blood ran in the dust. Fire licked at the rooftops. Screams and prayers mingled in the air. It could not last. The routiers regrouped, their numbers too great, their swords too sharp. The barricade splintered. One by one, the defenders fell. Some cut down in the square, some dragged from their hiding places. The widow fought to the very end, refusing to abandon those who could not flee. In the final moments, she stood before the chapel doors, bloodied but unbroken, daring the raiders to come for the last of her people. When the sun rose, the village was silent. The raiders had taken what little they could and moved on, leaving only ashes and the dead behind. But in the quiet that followed, word began to spread, from survivors, from those who returned to bury the fallen, from the whispers of neighboring hamlets. They spoke of a woman who, in the darkest hour, gave her people a choice, not between life and death, but between fear and dignity. Her name became a legend, passed from mother to daughter, from elder to child. She was remembered not for surviving, but for standing. The ruins of the village became a shrine, flowers left at the chapel door, stones placed atop the barricade's remains. Even the raiders, when they told the tale in far-off taverns, spoke of the peasant widow of Dordogne with a grudging respect. For one night, against all odds, a village had defied the darkness, and, though it cost them everything, their courage could not be erased. In time, the land healed. Grass grew over the graves. New villages rose on old stones. But the story of the widow who led a last stand endured, a quiet warning and an inspiration. That even in an age of kings and killers, it was possible for a single night to choose how you faced the end and to turn your death into a legend that would outlive the names and banners of all who would ever come to conquer. The night English archers shot farmers for fun. You don't hear the arrows until they land. It's the sound that lingers in memory, sharp, brutal, so fast that your mind refuses to believe it's real. Tonight, the only thing separating you from death is the whim of a foreign soldier, bored and drunk with victory. Your village is lost. Your family is lost. And now, beneath the cold eyes of the English, your life becomes a game, a fleeting moment of sport for men who call themselves warriors but act like hunters stalking trapped animals. The story is whispered even before the first arrow falls. In villages across northern France, the English have arrived, men in iron and leather, their banners marked with strange beasts, their speech rough and mocking. The knights take what they want, the best wine, the softest beds, the freshest bread. The peasants are left with scraps and fear. For the villagers, this is occupation, another season of hunger, another cycle of submission. For the invaders, it is entertainment. The archers are the worst. Unlike the knights, they have little to lose and less to fear. Hardened by years of war, carrying the longbows that shattered chivalry at Crécy and Agincourt, they view the people of this conquered land as nothing more than background. They drink, they gamble, they boast, and when the night grows long, they look for something new to amuse themselves. It begins with a dare. A group of young farmers dragged from their homes, trembling in the dust. The archers wager on who can hit the smallest target. They laugh as they fit arrows to the string. The first shot misses on purpose, just to watch the peasants flinch. The second is not so merciful. You see a neighbor fall, clutching at his side, blood already soaking through a tattered shirt. The archers howl with glee. The game has begun. You want to run, to vanish into the darkness beyond the firelight, but there is nowhere to go. The entire village is ringed with soldiers, their faces lit by the red glow of torches. The priest, who survived by hiding in the loft of the chapel, will later write of that night in a trembling hand. He will remember the faces of the men, twisted with laughter, the screams cut short by arrows that found their mark. For the archers, this is sport. They have spent their lives being trained to kill from a distance. In battle, their arrows decide the fate of kings. But here, in this village, their power is absolute and unchecked. There is no enemy to fight, no glory to be won, only helpless men, kneeling in the dirt, used as living targets. It is a massacre by another name, and it will be remembered only by the survivors, if any survive at all. The arrows come in waves. Some archers aim for the chest, others for the arms or legs, laughing at the wounds, jeering at those who cry out. A young boy tries to shield his father, but both are struck down. The game is rigged from the start. No one leaves alive unless the archers choose it. For the peasants, there is no honor in death, no chance to fight back. Their lives end not in battle, but in a cruel parody of one. In the chapel, the priest prays for a miracle, but even miracles feel too small tonight. He hears the laughter, the drunken songs, the slurred English words that float in through broken windows. He hears the silence that follows each arrow, as if the world itself has paused to listen. The priest cannot stop what is happening. He can only remember, and he does. Years later, his account will survive, a rare and damning record of what it means to be powerless in a world ruled by violence. The archers, when they tire of the game, move on. They wipe blood from their hands, boast of their aim, return to the fires where wine and meat await. They do not see the bodies left behind, do not care for the children who will grow up fearing the snap of a bowstring. For them, this night will become a story, a joke, a memory of conquest. For the village, it is an ending. Fields will lie fallow, houses will rot. The survivors, if there are any, will scatter, carrying the horror of this night with them for the rest of their lives. And in the heart of every survivor, there is a question that never leaves. What kind of man laughs while killing the helpless? What kind of world allows it? The answer is written in blood and ash in the empty eyes of those who did not escape. It is written in the priest's account, smuggled out before the English burn the church, hoping that someone, someday, will read and remember what happened here. This is not legend or propaganda, not a tale spun by enemies to stir hatred. It is fact, recorded by those who witnessed it, preserved in the words of men who risked everything to carry the truth. The night the English archers shot farmers for fun is not a singular atrocity, but a window into the casual cruelty that lives in the shadow of war. It is a warning echoing through centuries about what happens when violence is made into sport and human lives are reduced to targets. You cannot unhear the sound of those arrows. You cannot forget the laughter of the men who fired them. And somewhere, across time, the priest's words still burn. Let no one forget what men become when war gives them permission to be monsters. When peasants pretended to be dead to survive, war in the Middle Ages did not simply pass through the land. It consumed it, body and soul. For the peasant, each new conflict brought not the promise of glory or reward, but a silent calculation. What must I do this time to avoid the fate of my neighbors? By the time the first flames rose on the horizon or the screams echoed from the next valley, it was often already too late. Armies swept through with the impersonal force of a storm, searching for loot, for enemies, for anyone unlucky enough to be caught in their path. And so, in the darkest corners of European history, there grew a silent, desperate tradition. To survive, some peasants played dead, lying among the corpses of friends and family, hoping the soldiers would pass them by. Picture this: a battered village at dawn, smoke still drifting from half-burned thatch, the ground sticky and dark. For those left alive, the choice was agonizing. Flee and risk being hunted down in the fields. Hide and pray your hiding place is not discovered by a stray dog or the steel tip of a spear. Or, if you are quick and ruthless enough, collapse where you stand, face pressed to the earth, body twisted in a pose of death. With luck, you fall among the fallen, your heart pounding so loudly you fear it will give you away. All around you, the silence is broken only by the slow, heavy footfalls of men picking over the bodies, looking for signs of life, for valuables, for any last shred of resistance. There was no guarantee of safety. Soldiers were not fools. They knew that fear could freeze a person as completely as death. Some carried spears to prod the bodies, others watched for the faint shudder of breath. If they suspected a trick, they might plunge a blade into a limp form or turn a body with a boot to feel for warmth. Sometimes, simply flinching at the wrong moment was enough to mean the end. But still, for those with nothing left to lose, this feigned death was often the last faint hope. It was not cowardice, but an act of impossible courage, a wager played with fate itself. Chronicles from across medieval Europe record the harrowing stories of survivors who endured these moments. In France, during the 100 Years' War, entire hamlets vanished overnight, with only a handful of survivors crawling from the ruins after the soldiers moved on. Some were children lying beneath their mothers or pressed between the bodies of relatives, eyes squeezed shut against the horror. In Germany and the Low Countries, as mercenary bands known as free companies cut through the countryside, villagers learned to freeze at the first sound of armored men, sometimes lying motionless for hours, covered in blood and ash, ignoring the flies, the burning in their lungs, the gnawing terror that this trick would fail. The tactic was born of grim observation. After every massacre, a few would live, not because they were lucky, but because they had learned the behaviors of death, the slack jaw, the limp limbs, the eyes fixed and staring. Some smudged dirt on their faces to appear paler, colder. Others lay in awkward, painful positions, mimicking wounds. The trick was to become utterly still, to surrender every instinct to move, even as the world went mad around you. Sometimes those who survived could recall every sound, the jokes of the soldiers as they stepped over the bodies, the clinking of coins looted from the dead, the hiss of torches as cottages were set alight. These memories became scars, invisible but never forgotten. What drove people to such extremes? Pure necessity. For peasants, death in wartime was rarely heroic. It was arbitrary, cruel, and almost always pointless. To be seen alive was to be a target, for rape, for ransom, for torture, or simply for sport. In the worst times, when famine and plague rode alongside the armies, the only thing more terrifying than being found alive was being left behind for the wolves. Yet, even as the world seemed to collapse, the will to survive found a way. Pretending to be dead was not just about escaping the blade. It was about preserving some fragment of hope, a chance to rebuild, to keep a family name alive, to plant again when the soldiers had gone. Some survivors became living legends, their stories told in whispers by candlelight. They spoke of the unnatural calm that came in those moments, the feeling of floating outside your own body, watching as fate decided who would live and who would be left to rot. Others spoke of guilt. Why did I survive when so many braver souls fell? These burdens became part of the invisible cost of war, trauma carried through generations, shaping the character of villages, the songs and prayers of the people. But not all tales ended in safety. There are brutal records of those discovered and executed for their cunning, their deceit interpreted as defiance. Soldiers sometimes left no one alive, just to be certain. At times, after the carnage, the victors would round up any who stirred and finish the job, leaving no survivors to tell the tale. Yet even in this there was an act of resistance, the stubborn refusal to go quietly, the desperate gamble that life, no matter how fragile, was worth any indignity or risk. To the rulers and chroniclers, these peasants were often invisible. The history books remember the generals, the castles, the shifting lines of territory. But in the muddy fields and shattered homes, the real story was different. It was the tale of ordinary people, reduced to the most basic instincts, outwitting death itself with little more than their own wits and willpower. And so, as centuries passed, the legend of those who played dead to survive became part of Europe's haunted landscape. It is a lesson not only in cruelty, but in resilience. In every corner of the continent, families lived because someone had the courage to lie still among the dead, to swallow terror and wait for silence. When you walk the ruins of ancient villages or stand in the shadow of old battlefields, remember the invisible history under your feet, the survivors who, by pretending to be dead, ensured that life itself could continue even after the world seemed determined to erase them. The false peace treaty that led to a massacre. In the age of chivalry and banners, of treaties signed by torchlight and oaths sworn before God, there was an unspoken rule: even war has limits. But the world of the 100 Years' War was a place where desperation, hunger, and ambition ground old codes into dust. There, even peace could become a weapon, and trust itself the deadliest trap of all. This is the story of a village that gambled on mercy and was repaid in blood, a story repeated across medieval Europe, but one that still chills the heart with its lesson in betrayal. It began with the sound of boots on earth, English banners flickering in the dusk, and the shouts of soldiers echoing through narrow lanes. The village, unnamed in many chronicles, like so many erased by violence, was trapped between armies, its fields already trampled, its barns half empty. News of nearby raids had traveled fast. The villagers, mostly farmers and craftsmen, weighed their chances: resist and die, or surrender and hope for the best. When the English commander arrived, he came with promises. There would be no violence, he said, if the village laid down arms and pledged loyalty to the crown. No homes would be burned, no families torn apart, just a simple oath, and all would be forgiven. This was not unusual. Medieval war was as much negotiation as it was slaughter. Treaties were made and broken as easily as bread. For desperate people, the hope of peace, even false, was an anchor in the storm. One by one, the villagers emerged, men, women, and children, some still clutching crude weapons, some holding nothing but their children's hands. The elders spoke first, pleading for mercy. The priest invoked the sanctity of surrender. Under the pale gaze of the English captain, the villagers knelt and swore fealty. A treaty was signed, no more than a scrap of parchment, but it felt like the weight of survival. That night, the mood in the village was uneasy but hopeful. Fires burned low, a few dared to sing. Mothers wept with relief, children drifted into restless sleep. But as darkness deepened, the mood shifted. English soldiers moved with strange purpose. Doors were barred, whispers crackled in the wind. The sense of safety began to dissolve. Then came the signal, maybe a shouted order, maybe just the sound of steel drawn in the dark. The English struck with brutal precision. Men were dragged from their beds, arms pinioned, faces frozen in disbelief. There was no trial, no accusation, only the sudden, absolute reversal of mercy. Each man was accused of treachery, of breaking faith, of some imagined plot whispered into being by fear or suspicion. It didn't matter if it was true. The treaty was just a mask. The massacre had been planned all along. The screams shattered the night. Some men tried to fight, but there was nowhere to run. The English soldiers moved from house to house, cutting down every adult male in cold blood. The ground became slick, the air filled with the stench of blood and smoke. Mothers held their children tight, forced to watch as husbands, fathers, brothers were slaughtered in front of them. For some, the terror was so great they could not even cry out. They simply collapsed, broken beyond all words. By dawn, the village was transformed. Where there had been hope, there was only silence and ruin. Not a single adult male had survived the night. The survivors, women, children, the elderly, wandered among the bodies, their eyes hollow, their spirits shattered. The English left quickly, their work done, leaving only a few burned homes and the memory of betrayal behind. The message was clear. Treaties were tools, not promises. Mercy was a mask, easily discarded. For the English, this act was justified by treachery. But what treachery could justify the extermination of an entire generation of men? Chroniclers on both sides recorded the horror, some in shock, some in grim approval. For the villagers, the memory of that night became a curse, a tale passed down in whispers and in tears. Why did this happen? In part, it was policy, terror as a weapon, breaking the will of those who might resist. But beneath the strategy was something more primal. The way fear and desperation breed cruelty, how trust can be twisted until it becomes a noose. In the wars of the Middle Ages, treaties could offer hope, but more often they offered bait for the unwary. The aftermath was a kind of living death. Women tried to rebuild, but with every man gone, fields went untilled, crafts were forgotten, and families withered. Some villages never recovered, abandoned, reclaimed by weeds and silence, their names lost to all but memory. Others limped on, haunted by the knowledge that peace had cost them everything. Centuries have passed, but the lesson lingers. In every war, there are those who will trade on hope, weaponize mercy, and use trust as the sharpest blade. The massacre of a single village may vanish from official histories, but in the bones of the earth and the hearts of the broken, it is never truly forgotten. Remember, when you hear tales of treaties and chivalry, of oaths and honor, that history is written as much in broken promises as in victories. And sometimes the deepest scars are left not by the sword, but by the lie spoken before it is drawn. The bread riots that ended in public hangings. In a time when hunger ruled the land more cruelly than any king, the story of bread was the story of life itself. The peasant's year was measured not in days, but in harvests, in the relentless gamble of weather and war. When crops failed, there was no safety net, only empty bellies and the long, gnawing ache of hunger that blurred the line between despair and rage. It was in these lean years that bread became more than food. It became hope, power, and all too often the spark for violence that would echo through entire regions. The bread riots did not begin as planned rebellions. They started in shadows, in whispers traded over cold hearths, in the eyes of mothers who watched their children waste away. Word would spread that somewhere, just out of reach, grain was being hoarded, locked away in the barns and granaries of local lords or wealthy merchants. To the starving, this knowledge was a torment beyond endurance. They saw their own children's bones showing through thin skin, while the granaries stood full behind iron locks. The injustice was more than they could bear. It took only a few brave or desperate souls to ignite the riot. Often a small crowd would gather outside a granary at dawn, pleading first, then demanding, then pushing against the doors. Sometimes the doors broke under the weight of hunger. Sometimes guards were overrun. Inside, mountains of grain or stacks of hard black bread were seized in frantic hands, passed out in chunks or scattered in the street. There was rarely time for order, only the raw chaos of survival. For a brief moment, the powerless tasted victory. But the response from those in power was always swift, merciless, and coldly calculated. Lords and local officials, threatened by any challenge to their authority, moved to crush these uprisings with overwhelming force. To them, the riot was not about hunger, but about rebellion. It was an assault on the social order, a challenge to the hierarchy that placed them above the desperate masses. If peasants could take bread today, what would they take tomorrow? Riders would be sent for the nearest soldiers or mercenaries. Sometimes the local lord himself would arrive, armor gleaming, surrounded by armed retainers. There was no room for negotiation. Those identified as leaders or even participants in the riot were dragged from their homes, sometimes plucked from the crowd as they clutched their stolen bread. Trials, if they occurred at all, were swift and brutal. Guilt was assumed. The sentence was almost always the same: hanging. The executions were not held in secret, but in the very heart of the villages or at crossroads where everyone would see. Gallows were erected quickly, sometimes using the same beams that once supported the granary roof. The condemned, often young men, and sometimes even women, were marched before their neighbors, families forced to watch. There was no dignity in these deaths. The authorities wanted it that way. The message was simple: this is what happens when you dare to challenge the order. Hunger was not an excuse. Starvation was not a defense. Justice, in these times, wore the face of terror. And so the bodies were left hanging long after the breath had left them. Days, sometimes weeks, until the birds and weather had their way. Children were made to walk past, mothers forced to avert their eyes. The sight of neighbors, friends, even family suspended as warnings burned itself into memory. The message was received, but it was not always accepted. Fear could silence a village, but it could also plant seeds of deeper anger and resolve. Despite the threat of death, the cycle repeated itself across generations and kingdoms. Hunger returned year after year. Grain prices soared with every rumor of war, every frost or drought, every hint that next season would be worse than the last. Hoarding grew more common, and so did riots. Some lords attempted reforms, opening granaries in exchange for loyalty or labor. But more often, they answered with the rope and the sword. The church, often caught between sympathy and self-preservation, would sometimes plead for mercy. But even here, compassion was limited. The need for order, for the unbroken chain of power, trumped the demands of charity. The world was built on obedience and fear, and hunger was merely another tool to enforce both. The bread riots left deep scars. In some villages, entire families were lost, names blotted from the records. Children grew up remembering the hangings more vividly than any sermon. For the survivors, the memory was an open wound, a reminder that in the eyes of power their lives mattered less than the order imposed from above. Yet there was always a stubborn dignity beneath the pain. The riots, though often crushed, were not meaningless. Each one was a statement, a desperate refusal to accept starvation in silence. The courage of those who stormed the granaries, knowing what the price would be, became a whispered legend among the oppressed. In the fields and hearths, stories of resistance persisted. A child might ask why bread was so precious, why so many old women wept at the sight of a loaf. The answer was always the same: because it had been paid for over and over in blood and fear. As centuries passed, the gallows rusted and the memory of public hangings faded from the living world. But the lessons lingered. Even now, when bread is plentiful, there is a ghost in every loaf, a reminder of a time when to eat was to risk everything, when hunger drove the powerless to storm the gates, and when justice was measured not in fairness, but in the terrible weight of bodies left hanging for all to see. The story of the bread riots is a story of endurance, of suffering and punishment, but above all, of the unbreakable will of people who would not let their children starve in silence. And that is a lesson that refuses to die, even when the bodies have long since vanished from the trees. The forgotten forest children who survived alone. Imagine the silence after slaughter, the kind of silence that follows not just a single death, but the sudden erasure of every voice that gave a place its shape. In war-torn medieval France, entire villages vanished in nights of fire and screams. But sometimes, in the aftermath, in the blackened ruins or deep among the tangled trees, something remained. Not ghosts, not echoes, but children, alone, forgotten, left to the forest because the world that should have cared for them had been consumed by violence. No one planned for them. When mercenary routiers descended on a hamlet, no one counted the children hiding under floorboards, pressed into haystacks, or crouched at the edge of the fields. When the killing was over and the raiders had taken what little food and silver could be found, these children emerged into a silence so complete it felt like the end of the world. They called for their mothers and fathers. They found only blood and burnt wood. With no one left to comfort or command them, they wandered, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone, into the forest's deep, indifferent green. To survive, they had to vanish themselves. The world was a predator. The children learned its rules fast or died. Hunger taught them to eat whatever could be found, roots, nuts, bitter berries, sometimes the hard crusts left behind by passing soldiers or refugees. They drank from muddy streams and slept in hollows beneath tangled branches. When it rained, they shivered in the dark. When it was cold, they huddled together, if there was anyone left to huddle with. Some children were so young they forgot their own names. Older ones clung to scraps of memory, a lullaby, a father's last words, the smell of bread. But memory faded quickly when each day became a struggle for survival. Their hair grew wild, their clothes turned to rags. They learned the ways of animals, watching foxes and deer for signs of danger. If they heard distant shouting or saw the smoke of another raid, they ran deeper into the thickets, trusting the shadows more than any adult. Sometimes, after weeks or months, travelers or monks would stumble upon these forest children. What they found was not the wide-eyed innocence of fairy tales, but a haunted, feral resilience. The children were silent, wary of every movement, hands ready to bolt at the first sign of a stranger's approach. Some were too weak to flee, malnourished, bones sharp under skin, eyes hollow with suspicion. Others had banded together into small, desperate families of their own, sharing whatever scraps they found, fiercely protective of each other. Chroniclers from the time described the horror and heartbreak of discovering these children. There are records of entire groups of orphans emerging from the woods, unable to speak, scurrying away on all fours, more like wild creatures than the sons and daughters of men. Some would only accept food if it was left out, and the giver retreated. If anyone tried to force them from hiding, they bit and scratched like animals. In some cases, it took weeks to coax a single word from their lips. In others, the trauma ran too deep, and they never spoke again. Those who survived long enough to be found faced a different struggle. Some were taken in by monasteries, their heads shaved, their bodies scrubbed clean. But the wounds of loneliness and terror did not heal with bread and shelter. Many remained withdrawn, forever marked by the months or years they spent in the wild, flinching at sudden noises, staring at the sky as if they expected the world to burn again. Others were not so lucky. If discovered by unscrupulous men, they might be forced into servitude or even sold to workhouses, never again knowing the warmth of a real family. Yet, even in the bleakest stories, there is a strange kind of hope, a proof that life, even broken, will fight to continue. Some forest children grew strong. They learned to trust again, became apprentices, laborers, or rarely adopted sons and daughters. A few became legends in their own villages. The boy who survived 3 winters alone, the girl who led a band of orphans out of the trees. Their eyes always held a shadow of the forest, but their stories spread, warnings and wonders both. To the adults who heard their tales, the lesson was clear. The world could end in a single night, and the weakest left to fend for themselves. Mothers clung tighter to their children, knowing fate could be merciless. In time, new villages rose from the ruins, and children played in the fields once again. But the memory of the forgotten forest children remained, A dark thread woven through generations, a reminder of how fragile safety is, how quickly civilization can vanish, and how, even in the face of absolute loss, the will to live flickers on. Centuries later, the woods of France still hold their secrets. Roots twist over the stones of vanished cottages. Wind whispers through branches that once hid the last survivors of a village erased by violence. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. Not the laughter of children, but the stubborn, fragile heartbeat of life, refusing to give in, clinging to shadows and silence, waiting for the world to remember them.